Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Alice and Nahum Lainer Lunch and Learn, where we aren't lunching, but we are learning. Although you may be lunching, I don't know. Wherever you are, I hope if you're not lunching, you have lunched or will lunch. However, I admit that the subject is not exactly conducive to building up a good appetite. But it is important, and I did think that it covered a lot of territory in the Jewish constellation of ethics and morals, and therefore would be worth looking at. Now, we're going to be talking about suicide and euthanasia. Before I begin, please understand that these issues are vast and have many, many, many different not only facets, but also commentators who have said important things relating to both suicide and euthanasia in Jewish law. And we are not going to be able to do justice to the vast panoply of Jewish commentary on these subjects. But I do want to give you a little bit of an outline of the way Jewish legal thinkers in particular have thought about this. And I'm going to do that first by reading you a couple of sources, or recounting to you a couple of sources, since nobody likes to be read to for any length of time, because you might think, euthanasia is such a modern concept, like whether you pull the plug or you don't pull the plug. Well, in ancient times, they didn't have a plug. So how could Jewish authorities used classical texts to reflect on these things? And the answers are both illuminating and sometimes surprising and interesting. First of all, in terms of suicide, before we get to euthanasia, the locus classicus, as they say, the most central text, is that of Saul in the book of Samuel. Saul says to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through," but the armor bearer won't do it. So Saul asks someone else to kill him because he's about to be captured by the Philistines. He won't do it. Saul kills himself, right? He falls on his own sword. So we have an example of suicide. How that is treated and what that means, we will return to in a moment. Then we have the question of whether you can help someone else, that is euthanasia. Let's say, then I'm going to give you a couple of examples. One may not close the eyes of a dying person because that might hasten their death. So that's clearly against it. On the other hand, we have this story of Hananiah ben Teradion that we read every year on Yom Kippur, who is wrapped in a Torah scroll, and the Romans put wet cotton in the scrolls, in holes in the scrolls, so that it will take longer to burn, thereby maximizing his agony. And what does he do? He says, his disciples say to him, "Open your mouth." In other words, let the fire in. And he says, I don't know how he says this without opening his mouth, but you understand the story. He says, "No, I don't want to do that. I don't want to injure myself. I don't want to, in other words, commit suicide." But then the Roman soldier who is attending him says, should I take the tufts off? And he says, "Yes, if you do, you'll get the world to come." And he takes the tufts off. In other words, he assists him in dying more quickly. And that is praised. A voice from heaven comes down later and says that he's gotten the world to come for having done that. So on the other hand, there are then these somewhat ambiguous sources, like Rabbi Nahum says in the name of Rabbi Abba bar Ahuva, "Love your neighbor as yourself, choose for him mitah yafa," which means a good death. Others, don't let him die in suffering. And then there are stories of, this is a story in the Talmud that is commented on by medievalists, by Rashi, who lived at a time when the Crusades inflicted untold horrors on Jews. And it tells the story of 400 boys and girls who are abducted to be abused in all sorts of terrible ways. And they killed themselves instead of being abused. And what they said was, if we drown in the sea, we'll attain the life to come. In other words, it's better to die than to go through that. All of these sources will have implications for what we are allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. Let me just give you two more sources, because these are both really interesting. The last one's very, very fun. Fun in a certain sense, in the sense that any of this discussion is fun. One is in a medieval source, in Shulchan Aruch, it quotes this: if someone is chopping wood and that's keeping the person inside alive, like the sound of it is keeping them alive, can you close the window? Can you stop the noise? And the answer is yes. And even more dramatically, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who was the compiler of the Mishnah, a great scholar, he was in pain. He was clearly in pain, but his students were ringed around the house praying for him so that he shouldn't die. And his housekeeper, about whom a couple of stories are told in the Talmud, saw the pain he was in. So what did she do? She went up onto the roof and threw a jug down from the top of the roof. And the smashing noise that it made at the bottom stopped them from it, startled them, stopped them for a minute from praying, and he died. So you can understand the analogy here, which modern Jews, that was like he was on the life support system. And she pulled the plug effectively by smashing the jug on the ground. Now, let's take both of these questions. There are other sources as well, but I'm just going to leave it with those for the moment. And let's take all of these questions in turn and just give you a sense of the range of opinion and the philosophical underpinnings with which Jewish law has approached these issues. First of all, there is a prohibition against suicide, but you might ask yourself, well, why? Because after all, it's your body. If you want to eat something, that's your right. If you want to drink something, that's your right. If you want to inflict pain on yourself, that presumably is your right. However, the truth is that according to Jewish law, it is not your right, because your body doesn't belong to you. Your body belongs to God, and it is on loan. And therefore, you are expected to take reasonable care of it. In the words that I've quoted many times from one of my teachers, Rabbi Dorff, your body's like an apartment. That is, nobody expects you to return it in exactly the same condition that you got it. You'll put up a few posters, there'll be a bird mark in the rug, but you can't trash the place because it's not yours. And therefore, to commit suicide is considered a sin in the Jewish tradition. And someone who commits suicide classically is not buried in the Jewish cemetery, buried outside the gates, because that's how that's a sort of social sanction against it, because obviously you can't punish somebody in their life who's committed suicide. However, as you and I both know, there's suicide and there's suicide. And it can be very, very painful to live in this world. And we have to try to find some measure of compassion. Now, there are some opinions that are often availed of in questions of where you bury someone. There are some opinions that a suicide who is not in his or her right mind, that is, they did not make a rational decision at the moment that they killed themselves, they're permitted to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. And very often, that's what will happen, is somebody will make that decision. They were so driven out of their mind by fear, by pain, by the prospect of shame, by worry, by whatever it is, that and the evidence is the result. That is, the fact that they committed suicide shows you that they were not in their right mind, because they lived X number of years being okay and not doing this. And it's often, as you know, tied to some kind of mental illness, which precipitates the suicide, or an addiction, which precipitates suicide, or the prospect of something horrible happening that the person thinks they can't sustain. So with all of that, the question then becomes, what are the parameters apart from mental health? And here, it may or may not surprise you that Saul's suicide in the Tanakh, in the book of Samuel, in the Bible, is not disapproved of, not in the Bible and not subsequently. It's not disapproved by David when he gives his famous eulogy at the beginning of 2 Samuel for both Jonathan and Saul. And the rabbinic, prevailing rabbinic interpretation of this is the reason Saul is not condemned is he was going to fall into the hands of the Philistines, and it would be basically a chilul Hashem. It would be a desecration of God's name for God's anointed to be captured by the Philistines, and who God only knows what they would do to the king of Israel. And so you find throughout the Middle Ages in particular, and we're going to come to the Holocaust later in just a minute, but you find throughout the Middle Ages in particular, the preference for martyrdom over apostasy. Many Jews died, some by suicide, and many, many, many more by the hand of their enemies, rather than convert, which they considered a desecration of God's name. And in that category, suicide was generally not condemned and not thought of as a sin. And there was a remarkable book, truly remarkable, painful book, fascinating book called Mina Ma'amakim, From Out of the Depths. It's from a rabbi named Ephraim Oshry, and he survived the Holocaust. And during the Holocaust, he gave Jewish legal opinions about dilemmas that Jews had faced in the Holocaust. It might be worth a class just on some of the dilemmas he faced and how he answered. But for the moment, let's just restrict ourselves to one particular tshuva that became very famous, where a man basically said to him, "They are going to put my entire family to death before my eyes. I don't believe I can survive that. I don't want to see it. I want to kill myself. Am I allowed to do so?" And Oshry gave him permission, said, "You are allowed to." Now, as is so obvious that it requires really no statement, this is an example where the extremity is so great and the awfulness and the pain so intense that it is neither a precedent nor something that we can judge. You can't possibly say, "Oh, Oshry was wrong," because this is beyond wrong or right, the degree of pain and horror that was inflicted by the Nazis on this man and on so many others, but in this instance on this man. So I think that nonetheless, Oshry felt like he had a legal leg to stand on in the Jewish tradition, as you've heard. The instance not only of the 400 who were going to be abducted and abused, but also the story of Saul. When you move from suicide to euthanasia, the question, if anything, becomes even more complicated. Because why would somebody want their life to end? Well, the different reasons demand different responses. If they want their life to end because they're in terrible pain and will soon die, that's very different than they want their life to end because they're just tired of living. And Jewish law has different categories, a goses, a treifa, for people who are either have a very limited time to live, that's a goses, or a treifa, somebody who has a terminal disease. And there, the questions of euthanasia are somewhat different from somebody who wants euthanasia just because they're tired of living. And there are two major considerations here that make Jewish law very hesitant to jump on the euthanasia bandwagon. The first, as you might imagine, is that it is extremely difficult to distinguish euthanasia from murder. And sometimes there isn't a distinction. And so you have to be extraordinarily careful about what exactly you're talking about. And the second is that once you begin this, it's very hard to stop. That is, society is not good at putting brakes on things that are permitted. And once you permit euthanasia and organize it and allow it, how do you decide, for example, if somebody is having temporary despair that they will come out of, or really wants this as on a permanent basis? These questions are not easy questions, and I don't think anybody would pretend that they are easy questions. But when they come to euthanasia, you're talking about ultimate questions as well as difficult ones. So the distinction that Jewish law makes and medical practice also makes between passive euthanasia and active euthanasia is also relevant here. Many authorities, on the fashion of the maid who went up to the roof and threw down the jug, will permit passive euthanasia. That is, not taking what are considered extraordinary measures, we'll come back to what those are in a moment, to prolong a life that is a life not worth living, a life either of consistent pain, a life where somebody doesn't have their faculties, on and on and on, that sort of life. And the question of extraordinary measures divides itself also into, you can say, all right, I can unplug this elaborate machine that is the only thing that's keeping you alive, but what about hydration and food? Is that active or passive to not hydrate? Let's say the person can't drink and you have to hydrate artificially. Well, 100 years ago, I don't know if 100 or 150 years ago or 50 years ago or whatever, that would have been considered, the person would have died, because if they couldn't take it in orally, there was no other way to feed them. Now there is a way to feed them. And so medical technology creates its own different categories of what is active and what is passive, because somebody who, on the one hand, the good part is somebody who couldn't have lived 50 years ago now can live and may live a good life and so on because of medicine. But on the other hand, somebody who would have died peacefully in their bed now can have a quite miserable life prolonged indefinitely by the application of all sorts of artificial things. And part of that certainly will be artificial hydration and artificial nutrition. So here you get lots of, the pie is sliced very differently. There are some who will not permit, some Jewish legal scholars who will not permit even passive euthanasia. That is, you do everything you can to keep the person alive as long as you can until they die. And you can understand the reasoning behind that. It is the slippery slope reasoning that among other things, the mandate of a physician is to prolong life as much as possible. The mandate of a physician is not to decide when somebody ought to die. Then there are many authorities who will permit passive euthanasia, but not active euthanasia. That is, you are not obligated to do everything to keep this person alive if they're in a terrible state, but you can't do anything to actively hasten their death. One exception that many authorities make is you can give medicine that is designed for another purpose, even if it hastens death. Like, let's say you're in terrible pain and morphine will hasten your death. I don't know if it will, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that morphine will hasten your death, but you're giving it to the patient so that they will be out of pain. That many authorities, of course, will permit. Because yes, it will hasten the death, but that's not why you're giving it. You're giving it so the person won't be in agony. And then there are those who allow some degree of active euthanasia, that is, forbidden not hydrating or feeding if the person is in a particularly execrable state. None of these are simple, obviously, and none of these are universal. But and all of them have, as you've heard from at least a short recapitulation of the sources, all of them have something of a leg to stand on, but it is not easy. Now, sometimes even very traditional authorities will come out with some opinions that will surprise you. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who is probably the leading posek, the leading ultra-Orthodox legal decider in the second half of the 20th century, said it's forbidden to maintain the life of a person who isn't fit to live by artificial means. In other words, you can't take extraordinary measures if the person has a life that's not fit to live. Now, I don't know what his exact definition of fit to live is on that, but he, like the former chief rabbi of England, who wrote extensively on this, Rabbi Emanuel Jakubowicz, he was the rabbi before Jonathan Sacks, both of blessed memory. He wrote many articles that permitted passive euthanasia, basically shave al ta'aseh, sit and do nothing, which is a legal category of Judaism in general, and also for many of us during the pandemic, just sit and do nothing. So there are one or two, there are a few traditional Orthodox authorities that will allow the withholding of food and nutrition, and some conservative authorities, including Rabbi Dorff, who will allow this. So that pretty much is the broad sort of panorama of the various views. And the landscape keeps shifting because medical technology keeps shifting. And it is also an agonizing decision for any family to have to make, because even if you know that this person is leading not a good life, and even if they leave a directive, and now of course you can leave medical directives that say I want you to pull the plug, it's still very, very hard to do. It's just hard to do, and I don't think that advances in medical technology will necessarily make it easier. It's agonizing, it's painful, but you should know, and I think that it's important to emphasize that there are really a range of views in the Jewish tradition on these very difficult questions, and there is no single view that is unquestionable and right. With that, if there are questions or comments that people would like to make, you can do so on the Facebook page or on the YouTube channel. As I am scrolling through, so far I don't see questions or comments, but let me know if you have any, and I will be happy to answer. So I'll take a moment and wait and see. Okay, I know there's a delay, so that time that I was sitting there and watching, you had probably not gotten to the part where I said you could ask questions yet, but now you have, and I gave you space. So while I riff on questions of life and death, and suicide and euthanasia, I will see if in fact any questions come up that you would like answered. Because, as I said, this is one of those areas where ethicists are making a living these days. My brother among them. He is a medical ethicist. In fact, he runs the Ethics Center at Emory University and teaches bioethics. because you can apply serious ethical principles to medical technology, and there is no end to it. As it changes, so do the questions, and so do some of the answers. But I have now reached the part where I see that there are no questions after the silence. And so with that, I will thank you for having joined us. And I hope that you appreciated both the sources and the range of possibilities about these very difficult and wrenching and human questions. I look forward to seeing you on Thursday morning for Thursday Morning Torah, and on